Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of That Early Childhood Nerd. I'm Heather Burnt Santee, and I have three really fun people here today. Pretty excited to have this conversation. I'm going to let them each introduce themselves and just change it up a little bit. But Richard, would you start? Only because you're on the top part of the screen next to me and not for any other reason. Would you please go first?
I was hoping for other reasons, but all right. Hi, I'm Richard Cohen. I've been an early childhood professional for over 40 years. I teach community college right now, early childhood, and I travel all over the world giving keynote addresses at early childhood conferences.
Thank you. Bethany?
Hi, I'm Bethany Corrie. I am the owner and childcare provider at the Children's Borough in Maryland.
I just love that you're doing the Children's Bureau again.
Yeah.
You took a break for how long between doing
about 2 years.
Yeah, I'm so glad you've got it going again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. It's
All
been
right.
good.
Yay, thanks. And Jesse.
Hey, I'm Jesse Coffino. For the last decade plus, I've been working very closely with educators in Anji County, China, primarily Ms. Chung Shui Chin, and then educators around the world to understand the ideas that they've been kind of putting into practice, for lack of better words, in their context, in their community, and then seeing how it helps other educators in other contexts understand children and play. And so Anji play, true play, these ideas are things that I've just, spent the last decade or so working very closely with.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm glad you're all here, and we can turn this at some point into just a we love Anji play conversation too, as we go. Richard kind of wanted to do that when we talked about this article originally, and I said, no, we're talking about the article. But with you here, Jesse, we might really get into some of the other good stuff.
And I think it even raises the question of sort of what is Anji play, because I've been doing some podcasts recently, where the question really is like, what is this thing? We've heard about it. Like we have some impression of some aspect of it. Like, what does this thing even mean? Like, what are we talking about when we say Anji play? How does that relate to whatever we're doing in our context? And so, I mean, that was why I really wanted to be here, was because you all were bringing up an article that we wrote for Teaching Young Children, which is kind of like the practice side of NACCE's publication arm. They've got Young Children, which is more like kind of like peer review, research based, and then Teaching Young Children, which is much more like practitioner focused. And so for us thinking about, okay, so what does translate into that context? Like, what is, if we have this one chance to share a message about this thing with like a particularly important group of educators, right? American early educators that are working within the NACCE kind of like accreditation organizational system, which is not every early childhood program in the United States, but there's a good number, right? Like, what does that mean? And so for us, it was focusing sort of on this idea of stepping back. And the reason we kind of went there, I think one of my reasons for really deciding that to be the area is because it is a really big difference that we notice between what happens in Anji County and a lot of programs that we've been to, like around, like literally around the world, that embrace ideas of play or like child-centeredness or like observation. And I can go into the weeds around any number of things. We can get into Reggio, we can get into Montessori, we can get into Waldorf, we can get into high scope and creative curriculum and like assessment standards and like models of professional development. But what we really saw as a difference, but something that like aligned it really with like what great early educators around the world have always done, and like great parents in some sense have always done, which is like see children as really capable, provide them with like an unconditionality of love, but then kind of like back off a little bit and like be like, well, like I'm going to actually be interested in what you're doing and like give you time and space to figure things out, right? And that is, there's many different reasons in my mind, and like I'm sure you have reasons too, why that's not happening a lot in a lot of different contexts. We feel like that's where we wanted to go, and we needed to kind of point out in some sense that like to truly nurture a child, right? To truly provide space for them to be independent, to like overcome challenges. They both have to have time and space and like access to lots of different things, but they also need really present adults who can appreciate that or like try to understand it, or even like try to take whatever they understand from that and make it a part of their environment. And so again, like in some sense, this is making an argument for a very simple and specific notion of best practice. But again, it's something that like, again, a lot of traditional forms of parenting, like people that I saw who I know who worked in Head Start in the 70s before like a kind of neoliberal push for like assessment and like a lot of curricular fidelity, they were doing this too, right? And so that's why we love the word true play, because that's describing like a particular experience of play. And then Anji plays this whole other like cosmology of like lots of different like moving parts and interesting things. And I think a lot of powerful practices. But I think for me, like whenever I'm trying to get the message out, or even through that article, it's just like, well, let's reassess what we really see as caring and protecting for children. And let's hold it accountable to like love, like a controversial term, no doubt, but at least something we could talk about in some way, I guess.
Yeah, so I'm going to jump in and first just say, so it's maybe a month ago that the episode came out with this article we keep talking about that I haven't really brought back in yet, but we talked about Richard and Bethany and I, an article that you wrote with Emma Pickering and Christina Tapia called Stepping Back to Nurture from Teaching Young Children. And we'll get to that, but can we take about, I don't know, I'll say 20 minutes and see how that goes, to just talk about Anji play and maybe pick up on that idea of love, because Richard, I know that was one of the things that really stood out to you. So can I give it to you for a minute here, Richard, now? And
well, I mean, primarily I'm curious to hear from Jesse how love shows up in a concrete, practical way in programming. You've heard me talk about many times the importance of love in early childhood and my frustration with any EYC for not having that word in any of their documents
or care
formally, or care. Isn't that so odd and disturbing? And so, yeah, I'm really curious, you know, if Anji Play has put that term in and made it, brought it to life, why wouldn't an EYC adopt that when they have concrete evidence of love in a program being applicable? So I'm curious, Jesse, what you think?
I mean, I think, like, honestly, I think a real big thing for NACCE, and I think a big challenge with the DAP generally, is it kind of like takes a stance without taking a stance on a lot of things.
Yeah.
Like it doesn't want to take the risk of like saying something is better than something else. And so it has to allow, and I know that it's in the service of responding to every cultural context and not, you know, judging people's values, but I think that in interesting ways, like I look at the NACCE DAP and I hold Anji Play when I know of it against that, and it actually checks a lot of boxes. So like in some sense, it's like it can be a guide for understanding things, but I think it leaves a space for nothing to really be claimed in some sense, right? And I guess that gives us the freedom to claim it ourselves, but then in expecting them to sort of get behind it, I don't know. I mean, I think part of it for them, what was controversial was saying like, oh, you know, you shouldn't like sportscast, like you shouldn't talk while children are playing, like, oh, like, you know, there's a conflict perhaps between children becoming capable and like adults constantly talking to children, right? And so I think there's aspects that are just like straight practice things that probably are in conflict with other things they're selling or promoting as part of their, you know, whatever is DAP aligned, right? In terms of professional development or how they lobby. I can't speak to that. I haven't done the research. Those are just kind of like my sensibility. I think that love, I mean, I wish I had recourse right now to video to like share videos of teachers in practice to see kind of like what love can look like. But I guess that part of like the Anji Play idea is that reflection is a big part. Like there's like 5 principles, reflection is the last, that a lot of the work that's done in a professional context is like looking at videos of children playing, looking at the drawings that they've drawn, like coming back to what we're calling and thinking about like, oh, like how am I providing safety and responsiveness in this moment? Like, what am I doing to provide for that child's needs while also providing like the minimum necessary structure so that they can like independently solve the problem themselves. But of course, like there's the notion of like the teachers or the educators coming together to develop schedules with minimal transitions, or that allow children to like play as long as they need to or have as much time for cleanup as necessary. There's like a conception of like expectations rather than rules, right? Like you don't hurt yourself, you don't hurt other people, you don't hurt the environment, you put things back where they came from. But in that, like you're in Anji Play, it's very intentional about storage so that children really do know where things go back to. And there is significant time for children to clean, like more than they need, right? And so like in the development of the structure, there's this notion of love as responsiveness. There's also just this notion of like, well, if children need to play, right? If like uninterrupted, and the American Journal of Pediatrics said this, like everybody knows that children need to be deeply engaged in like their own like intrinsically motivated activities that if that's a child need, then like protecting that and respecting that is a form of love, right? If we're saying love is being responsive to children's needs, children need to play, ergo protecting play is an act of love, or listening to the child is an act of love because it provides like information to the educator about how to create environments that support play. But there's a video that we look at a lot of a 3-year-old on their first day in an Anji Play school in Anji County. These are large public schools, like 400 kids at this school. The teacher's out there, and this child, this 3-year-old at first day, is just like beside himself because he can't have this sand toy that another child has. It was like 10 feet away, right? And he's never really been in like a group setting, and suddenly he's like there's hundreds of kids around. It's a big open environment, but like he wants that thing. And so you see this video of how that adult, that educator, is interacting with him in a loving and engaged way, but still like handing it back to him to solve, and listening to the other child and keeping it light, bringing him back in and like having physical contact. And so you can look at that. And I've done that in Anji County with Anji teachers and principals of that video, or with foreign people visiting Anji. And we've talked about like, what does love mean in this instance? So there's like a really specific way in which like love is sort of like, I guess, operationalized, but it always comes back to like us as a group, like revisiting and considering and thinking about what that definition means in practice. And I think that's like a difference between what a lot of, like, if you look at Montessori or other things that have curricular fidelity, is there's a lot of certainty around like, okay, here's the definitions, here's exactly what you do. And so I think one of the challenges, and I think the challenge of that piece that we wrote, is like it kind of starts by stepping back, but like how to do that in a way that is loving, right? Because what we're not saying is like abandon children to their own defenses. Which, I sometimes say jokingly, like some play approaches do. They kind of say adults are bad and like get them out of the way, like let children kind of run the show. And so that's definitely not what Anji play is about. Certainly you have true play in those settings, right? Like children do often doing their own thing. That's true play. Like, and more power to it, because those kids probably are learning more than they might be in school. But like we're advocating for like a particular approach to education. So there's like a very intentional role for the adult in that.
I think it makes us really uncomfortable in every setting other than Anji play, because of course we would think, well, of course there's love in our interactions with children, but there's also sort of a shrinking away of any kind of discussion of love, or it makes people nervous. And that's one of the things that I appreciate about Anji. Are they the principles of Anji play? What do you call is it 5
principles, ideas, words,
that it has explicitly said this is something that's going to be part of what we're doing, and we're going to be explicit about it, and we're going to acknowledge that it is no less than the children here deserve and the adults here deserve, right? I think it goes both ways.
And probably like I think that like, we have to look at how to at the administration, or program directors, how systems are. And I think this ties back to what a lot of you three in particular discuss a lot, like these notions of care, right? And so I think we can call it love, we can call it care. I think maybe the most challenging part of it is like this notion of like unconditionality, where it's like showing a child safety irrespective of like a future outcome, whether it's like a learning outcome or even a behavior outcome, and kind of irrespective of any past. So what their family life has been like, and just showing up and providing unconditionality. I think that's very challenging, because even though most cognitive science has moved beyond kind of like basic behaviorism, like Skinnerian behaviorism, like a lot of the way that education and like pop cultural notions of like how to manage behavior is just like rewards and consequences. It's like timeouts, taking things away, or withholding positive relationships to correct, or like otherwise like pressure a child in some way when they're not in a place to do that, right? And so I think that's challenging. But I think I mean, what's great is that in programs we work with that aren't even 100% embracing like the quote unquote the Anji play approach, that when they do have space and time to take videos of play and reflect, like they really can show up for those children in ways where they're not jumping to the escalating series of like rewards or consequences that in subtle ways, again, even play-based, child-based educators deploy. And some of it also has to do with like our own emotional boundaries and self-regulation, and like how these are expressed vis-a-vis children, and like our, and that has to do with how we were raised. And that's all very touchy stuff, which is probably also one of the reasons that NACI has to play such a fine balancing act, because boundaries around really getting into people's lives, because like that impacts how they teach and how they see teaching.
Mhm. Well, I think one of my big concerns is, and Richard and Bethany, feel free to jump in if you want to, but one
Yeah.
of my biggest concerns is now, like as college instructor who is accredited by NACE and has this list of professional preparation competencies that I have to demonstrate that my students are leaving with, and not one of them mentions care, and play is very maybe once tucked in there, and love certainly not mentioned in there. And so I wonder if is it just because it's not measurable, or is it not valued because it's not academic content? And so that's when I read, because it for folks that weren't listening to the other episode, there's almost like there's an editor's note on your article written by NACE. It said NACE content is grounded in developmentally appropriate practice to foster young children's joyful learning and maximize the opportunities for each and every child to achieve their full potential. This article presents a teaching approach grounded in another educational philosophy, almost saying
Yeah.
this isn't DAP. What you're about to read isn't DAP.
Yeah.
If
And
they
so,
say our
Not almost
DAP
saying
is
it.
ours, but this is another one, that so that to me was a rejection
well, and
of
to my
stuff like
question is,
And
playing
my
then what
cards.
question is,
follows is questions, asking the reader to compare the two. So it
Yeah.
definitely sets them apart.
yeah, and
Mhm.
I think the question that was raised for me by that intro, and maybe just a little more poking on my part would answer it, is that
Yeah.
does that mean that DAP is a philosophy, right? Because
Mhm.
what they say is like, this is another philosophy. They don't specifically say DAP is a philosophy, but is that the case? And if so, like, how does it different? Like, what does that mean?
Mhm.
Well, they would say it's a position.
It's a position.
Right. Right. But that's not what this language says, but that's what they would, yeah, that's how they would frame it. I think it just
Right.
I do understand 100% that we can never say this is always the best practice in every situation. But I'd be hard pressed to find a situation where love and care and play were not best practice for
Yeah,
young
well,
children.
but I also think that, I mean, when we think about it, I had this thought during the pandemic, which is that, like, I know about this challenge of like deprofessionalization of early childhood professionals, certainly in Anji County, until Ms. Chung really instituted a lot of very specific legal reforms. Like early educators in Anji were kind of seen as like glorified nannies in some
Mhm.
sense, right? And so I think that during the pandemic, and I think before the pandemic, kind of moving away from this notion of like childcare worker, teacher. I like to use the word educator, although that
Mhm.
can provide some confusion when, like, I also think of as administrators and educator and differentiating roles, right? So I'll sometimes say teacher, but the idea that pretty much all of our primary and middle and like high school teachers are providing childcare, right? Like during the pandemic, being clear that like as much as they are teaching, they are providing supervision, responsibility,
Mhm.
like supposedly responding to the needs of children in their care. And so
Mhm.
I think that there is this problem where it's like, really, if you look at like what I find to be interesting research, like research into children who have been in very tough life circumstances, um, even children that have been in typical environments growing up, like having responsive, caring relationships with adults is good for their learning. It doesn't matter if they're 3 or an infant or
Mhm.
toddler, or if they're 16, right?
Mhm.
Or probably a grad student. And so I think that there's an opportunity if people wouldn't see care as like a somehow like a lower status or a lower, like a less complex perhaps or
Mhm.
meaningful contribution and type of labor, because I think that like in every situation, if you're providing really responsive environments, you're really much clearer on the needs of the people in your environment. And if you really are committed to education, like your goal is to understand what people are capable of and then like provide the environment for them to excel, right? And I
Mhm.
suppose if you're teaching a particular subject in a particular area, you want them to excel. But I would argue that like in most situations, that's kind of the outcome you're looking for. And so I think that's very threatening to, I don't mean to sound conspiratorial, but like there's a lot of interests around maintaining complexity and like top-down
Yeah.
versions of authority and systems of like compliance and punishment and stuff like that. And so I think it's a tough.
Well, there has to be a
The good news is I
deficit
think we
when
can all
there's a
feel it.
product to sell.
Yeah, I think that the for me the good news is like we're actually thinking about and creating models where that does show really surprising outcomes in terms of
Mhm.
learning and growth, right?
Mhm.
Then it's just a question of like scalability or like resources or like people agreeing on whether or not those observed outcomes are worth it or whether they're consistent. Because I think coming back to this idea of like, well, what is the evidence for love or what is the outcome of love? I mean, for us, it's like, okay, if you have a safe, responsive environment where people are trusted, where there's care, where there isn't judgment, people take risks, and not just like physical risks, like cognitive and social risks. They're doing things with uncertain outcomes based on a prediction, which is like the basis for learning, right? And discovery. And then they're experiencing joy. And so if we say like, oh, well, we want to observe an outcome of joy from environments of love, you might get laughed off the stage. But what I'd say is there is evidence for this stuff. Like,
Mhm.
I don't think there is a lack of evidence for like the needs of young children for safety and responsiveness and warmth in their lives
Mhm.
or experiences of risk or opportunities to reflect. Like, I think the evidence is there. I think it's just there hasn't really been a more systematic description of what that looks like in practice. And I guess that's what's
Mhm.
exciting. That's what keeps me waking up and writing and talking and just getting out there because I'm not an educator by birth. I mean, I guess I've been an autodidact my entire life, but I was brought into this work because of my understanding of Chinese language and culture and my pending fatherhood, right? And now I've got a 9-year-old and a 4-year-old. But it's allowed me to spend an incredible amount of time with like really incredible educators and children and
Mhm.
programs and thinking about what these things mean like across languages. And
Mhm.
so it's like I look at the history of like approaches or I'd say the closest thing to Anji play I've seen as like a articulated system would be like Magda Gerber and Emmy Pickler, working with infants and
Yeah.
toddlers. There are ways in which, Montessori is brilliant in observing the need for child independence, right? And creating environments where children have access to like real things to have to independently move through their environment. But like she has a very fixed idea of learning and like her
Yeah.
materials like instruct with very fixed things. And like you have to fold a shirt a particular way. And it's like laid against like an early 20th century, like Catholic progressive cosmology, right? Like, I mean,
Yeah.
really serious here.
Yeah.
Like,
Me too, but I'm just laughing to myself because Montessori is a whole other topic.
yeah, it's a whole other topic, right? Well, and the reason I
Yeah.
bring that up is because there was like, oh, Anji plays like Montessori for China, or they're like, it's Reggio from China, or it's this
Yeah.
or that. And it's like, I get the formal misconception of some
Yeah.
sort of alignment. And I've had to go in and drill down on like, what is it that
Yeah.
makes it look similar in some ways? And so
Yeah.
you can see and in any real innovation around the education of young children, which I think really always have impacts on the education of everybody else, because like how we learn as young children is pretty both complex and like has a lot of potential, right?
Mhm.
Like we always talk about like the beginner's mind, like how do we get back to that place in our learning to
Mhm.
achieve like really deep, like, moments of growth in like how we understand things that, yeah, I mean, I think that Anji Play has interesting answers to those things. And
Yeah.
again, it's not to say that everybody has to do this, but like at least we're going to be really honest and upfront about the things that we see and observe and believe, and then like try to bring our commitment to that to the table.
Uh-huh.
And so like even things, and I guess this comes to the question of evidence, it's like, okay, well, we're going to have all of our professional development for the next 6 months. Let's say it's every 2 weeks for a team of early educators. We're just looking at videos that you've taken of children in play, but there's time to talk about whatever's coming up in your work. That when you get to the end of the year or the quarter where these teachers are filling out like numeric observation-based assessments,
Mhm.
they have like hours of video that
Right.
provides like a much
It's
firmer
much more
base.
authentic,
It's much more
I think. Yeah.
authentic, and it's generally much stronger than
Mhm.
what is being observed in their peers in other places. And so you could say, well, okay, maybe there's some like observer bias where like, oh, you've been talking about in all this flowery language, you're going to see everything as genius. But I would argue that there's something to be said for creating environments where children are capable, but B, like actually spending time in a group setting where you can challenge your assumptions about what particular learning is taking place. Um, you know, does provide more insight on child
Yeah.
ability. And I think at NACCE, it's like it's going to be tough to say like teachers are smart enough to come together on their own and talk about videos and that be enough professional development, right? Like a lot of people don't want to hear that because
Right.
that challenges a lot of the ways in which they see deficiencies in educators and the ways that they have answers that they want to fill.
For
And so I
sure.
don't discount that being a part of it as well.
Yeah. So I want to let the other side of the room talk if you
Yeah,
want
please.
to talk, because it's just been me and Jesse for a minute. But so what's coming up for you guys? Anything?
Well, when I've been listening, and when I was reading the article again and kind of revisiting this, something that kind of, I didn't realize it jumped out at me, but as you guys were talking, um, just like the idea that maybe it's like fear-based, where people sort of push back against this idea of
Mhm.
love. And I mean, you could even go as far as saying, trusting the children and things like that. Like there's one sentence in the article: if a child is not ready to play or is communicating through their behavior that they need the love and support of an adult in that moment, their need for an authentic relationship always comes first.
Mhm.
And I can imagine a lot of, more mainstream educators, caregivers, whatever, hearing that
Mhm.
or experiencing that, where, like, I mean, it's basically saying, the kid's having a meltdown, or he's, you know, um, he's putting up really firm resistance to do, the activity or something forward.
Yeah.
Where in a traditional setting, the teacher will make the child do that. Like, the activity comes first, the
Yeah.
learning comes first. Um,
It's like
and
anti-planned ignoring.
yeah,
If there's a meltdown, you ignore it because they're just trying to get your attention.
right. Don't
That's
give
not what
them,
this is
yeah,
saying.
because
Yeah.
then they'll just have a meltdown
Yeah. They'll
if you
just
keep giving them comfort when they are
ask for comfort. God.
screaming for comfort. How dare you? Um, uh,
Yeah. Well,
and so reading that line, it made me think, like, that could have been the reason why they had to put that disclaimer at the beginning of the article, because like um how is, it's hard to say how is that developmentally.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess it's not hard to say.
How am I going to
But
measure if my teaching met the standard if we stop the teaching to meet the
yeah,
emotional needs and we
yeah,
never get to the
yeah,
I know.
yeah.
And
product?
And like the just the idea of making, like, looking back, reflecting on children's play, and talking, I think, Jesse, you said, using the flowery language to describe it. Like, isn't that what we should be doing? Like,
absolutely.
today my son and one of his like the child that he was always playing with in our group, um they just laid on a picnic table, like one on the bench, one on the table part, and just like talked about what they saw underneath the table. And it was so cool. And like they fight like siblings a lot, and so it was just a great moment that they were connecting together. They were, he's 3.5 and she's newly 2 years old, and so he's able to like use all of this language that she doesn't know about describing things, and he's showing her how it works and everything. And and you could look at it. I took a picture because it just looks like they're laying on a table, and you could say, well, they're not doing anything, but there's so many layers of what's happening. But how do you,
Or you could look at it and say, "Oh, I'm losing a teachable moment here."
right? I should go name the parts.
Mhm.
But by
Color,
not
is
doing
that true, you're
anything
saying?
Yeah.
and just watching, right, and
Yeah.
taking a picture, that was an act of love.
Yeah.
Yeah,
You did
Exactly.
that
Yeah,
from a
exactly.
place of love.
yeah,
Yeah, that desire to respect that time and space, to try to understand what's going on, to
right.
see this having value, to kind of take the perspective of the child and say, like, you see this as having value. Like, anything else that I do is about the value that I add to it. Right.
Yeah.
And so I think the thing that we remind ourselves is like, well, by respecting that moment, we're adding value. I mean, that's the irony, is like there are so many ways in which we actively add value to the child's learning just by being present, or just by showing our curiosity, or just like I say, just by listening to them talk about like what they've done, or like just by providing abundant, open-ended, minimally structured materials and transitions that respect their needs.
And
It's
by
like,
stepping back.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And so I think there is this question of like a fear of the implications of what being like truly accepting of children is, which is letting go of a lot of that stuff, right? And so like there's both like the letting go of like my role in teaching, like my raison d'etre, right, in this field, right, of making children smarter or helping their like it's like scaffold or like supporting their learning, which is those are important, great things to want, right? It's
Right.
great to want a child to get smarter and smarter every minute they're like in your space, right? And so like those aren't bad intentions, of course. And then I think it's the question of like what has like organizations that have leadership, like what have systems, what have the systems that like tell people what to do, like what do they put first, right? In that process of preparing adults to provide that for children. But I think, there is this like I kind of call it the hypothetical teacher who it's like when I'm doing professional development at school, it's like every day it's like, well, what happens with this? What happens with that? And it's like, well, like, let's see a video of it. We'll talk about what actually happened, right? And I don't see it in that way, but it's like that there are like the initial hypotheticals that make a lot of sense. Like what happens like when some kid hits with a shovel, like what do I do there? And it's on us to communicate like what it means to be responsive, to provide safety for other children if a child is going to hurt themselves or other people or what's going on there. I think the irony is that like when you let go a lot and give a lot more space, you start to eliminate a lot of behavioral noise that's coming from a response to kind of like you're withholding care in order to achieve compliance with like an outcome that comes from like the adult's emotional needs or like educational planning or like structural demands on the teacher or the lack of resources that teacher has to like take care of themselves to like be present and show up in a way that the children need, right? And so, but I think when you do let go of that, you have a lot less behavioral noise. And then you actually really do get to focus on those children that do have really big needs that are so complex, where even more unconditionality is going to help, right? It's like particularly those cases where it's not just like, for lack of better terms, like a bratty kid who's pissed because you're setting a boundary, but it's a child that really has a big need. Like children in particular, those children in particular need like time and patience and space and not being excluded or criticized. Or having that sense of safety taken away. And so I look at journal articles on like children and behavior in like middle school and high school, and it's like, how much would like a little love and care go in that environment to like benefit educational outcomes? If we even want to just look at it in those narrow terms. And then it's like we get to this whole other question, like we're starting with like subjectivity. It's like, who decided these measures? Like, is some correlation to a statistically significant increase in like later reading scores valid for taking away care and love children, right? When we're saying like the evidence probably is there scientifically that like children need that to really be at their best.
For sure. I think we've talked a lot in different episodes about not only fighting back against the academic push down, but fighting for a push up of care into those older grades and older systems. And
yeah, I know that.
It's not, it does benefit the children, of course, but it's going to benefit the adults too, who aren't spending their whole day.
Being around a whole bunch of joyous children that aren't like pissed because of what they've got to do. It's like your quality of life is going to generally.
Or feeling like any non-compliance is a sign that you're bad at your job. I just think that it opens things up for all of the people in that little system. Richard, looks like you want to say something.
Oh, well, I want to say 10 million things, but I can only remember 2, probably. I'm going to sound like a broken record here, which is a metaphor. Probably a lot of your listeners don't even know what that means.
Vinyl's still very hip, Richard.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm hip then. So yeah, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but that academic push down is a function of a patriarchal society that values, male power, male ways of being over female. So it's not a coincidence to me that, Jesse, you said the closest thing to Anji play is Magda Gerber's work with infants and toddlers, because the younger children get, the more female the field is perceived to be, and therefore further devalued than any possibly older age. And so it's difficult to, it is countercultural to try to push care up because you're fighting against a tide of patriarchy that pushes male values downward into early childhood. And the other thing this is maybe a bit different, but something I was thinking earlier. I've done a lot of workshops on love in early childhood education over the decades. And one of the ways it shows up is, Jesse was talking about getting smarter and smarter and valuing cognitive development. But what I see is not that. It's this I love the children in my care. I call them my kids, and I love them. And so that's why I push them to learn their letters and colors and numbers. And we do the worksheets and the flashcards and all
That's
that.
what you hear, or
Yes.
this is you
No,
talking?
no. That's what I hear.
Okay, yeah.
Because I
Ooh,
love them. I'm getting
so
them ready for
confused.
kindergarten.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes.
Getting them
Okay.
ready
Yeah.
for first
Yeah.
grade. And out of my love for them, I know maybe that they're not enjoying it or whatever, but what I do is out of love.
Mhm.
And so that word gets is very subjective,
Right.
Yes,
which is
absolutely.
part of why NACI shies away from it, because there's no way to define it in one way that is universal for all.
Well, they don't really try to define anything in one way. That's
But I think you bring up some
universal.
really, bring up some really interesting
Yeah.
ideas. I mean, one is our conceptions of safety, right? So it feels like we're providing safety as parents, as children, as systems by like making our children optimum participants in like an economy, right? So I think certainly like part of our economy, the reason for the way the global economies work has to do with like a long-term patriarchal system of like accumulation and extraction. And so I think that, and to argue for intersectionality, I mean, I think a lot of like economic realities, cultural realities beyond just gender also impact like how the practice of teaching is about like fear around scarcity. But I think something that you're bringing up is like I think we're teasing out perhaps in this article, like our urge to protect versus like what is actually providing for safety, right? So I think it's right to want your children to be safe, but maybe safety is not what's going to make them most comfortable in an academic environment at a particular point, but like what allows them to like make determinations about their environment or other people or ideas in a way where the child has some developing sense of judgment or experience, right? But I think that one of the reasons we have to start with that conversation of love is because, as you said, and I really appreciate you bringing this up, that there is also just like a certain like, sympathy or feeling that people have for children, right? Where they're like, oh, they are cute. Like there are these adorable things. And it's like, and so I was actually shocked on one of my first visits to Anji County, and I've been there many, many times, and I've interpreted and done different stuff. But in this particular instance, it was a professor from Shanghai Normal University, no nonsense woman in her 60s, very well respected, had become involved in Anji play because she went out and visited it randomly and saw like all these examples of things that made a lot of sense to her. And she was going on and on about like the cuteness of the children. And I was like, well, what is she talking about? Like, why is she talking in these terms? Like, why are the teachers talking in these terms? And what I realized is that like the children are really cute. And if that's like a really positive emotional way for connecting with a child while also giving them time and space and letting them have little fights and like, like that's a perfectly natural and healthy way to talk about children and to share with parents that might have the same sympathies, right? Or the same urges. And so if you can sort of make both arguments at once, right? These children are adorable. Like it's amazing. I love being like a little dad or mom with like my little group of like 30 kiddos. They're incredibly cute. Like look at this cute picture of them like jumping over a log, right? Like that's where I started to hear like the kind of straightforward talk, like bottom upness of this approach. There wasn't a fear of that language, and it connected with the people in a way that changed their practices in a way that made them more respected as experts. So there wasn't, it didn't take them away from reclaiming expertise through observation. It just like said that like, oh, these things that I feel are not bad, right? Like there's no judgment there either. And so if we're saying to children, there's no judgment, we kind of have to say that with our adults in a way that provides some framework for them to hold their views of children and their learning and their needs accountable, right? And so that's part of that aspect of reflection.
I think there's a flip side of and maybe this isn't where we need to go right now, but I feel like there's a flip side to that, children being cute. Like I talk about it, I'll tell cute stories. We just oohed and awed over Bethany's cute baby. It's the reality is they're cute, but I feel like there's a risk there of dehumanizing them
Sure.
if that's where
Sure.
we stop with it.
Yeah.
Like, I get that they need that because part of what they need to survive is for us to be drawn to them, and cuteness is one of the ways they draw us to them, kind of evolutionarily speaking.
No.
But I think that there is, if we just stop there, there's a
Well,
risk.
I think of course, that wouldn't be like the sum total of the thinking, but I
Yeah.
think also it's like, if that is a route into a degree of unconditionality, for saying like each child is a cute child, like of course they didn't mean, like, of course I shouldn't be angry at them for not doing this transition and not enough time. Of course I shouldn't be frustrated that they like interrupted my really highly planned project-based learning that like started a month ago based on two children's interests and something I was interested in. Like, I'm not going to be angry because they're just a cute, like,
Yeah.
to me that's okay, right? Like, what is the way that we do that? And like,
Yeah.
I would be a pretty big butthead if I said to the world, like, it's wrong to think that kids are cute, and that be a motivation for like providing the best possible experiences.
Sure.
Okay,
Yeah,
right?
and I'm not
Well,
saying it's
I'm
wrong.
gonna
If
jump
it's
in
wrong,
here.
then
But I
I'm
guess
wrong
it's like
all
we
the
have
I'm
to be
gonna
time.
jump
careful
in
about
Yeah.
here
that.
and say
We have to
that
be
for the
careful
last
about
30 years, I've
Yeah.
been a butthead. And I've said that
Yeah.
very thing to
Yeah.
thousands upon thousands of early childhood educators.
What, that they shouldn't
Heather,
call
I
kids
agree
cute?
with you that
No.
using the word cute is vastly inappropriate in
It
early
can
childhood
be, I
education.
think.
It can be. I don't know that this is the time and place for Jesse and I to have a knockdown drag
We're
out.
gonna have to have a whole new
Cute.
episode
So
about cute.
we had a whole bunch of mats from Anji that were delivered to a program in Northern California that were covered in camo canvas, because that's what they were having in Anji at the time, because like China's a militaristic, authoritarian country, and people are afraid of that.
Uh-huh.
And like at first, like the managers were like really anxious about that. The parents loved it. It's like a pretty rural area. I mean, it's a mixed population. It's a Head Start, early Head Start program. They love the camo. Like, that was not a problem for them. So I think it's like we should be careful about looking down on how people authentically describe their positive feelings for children.
Mm.
And I think that we should understand how we can use the positive feelings that should be seen as natural and good in a way that like creates more freedom and love for children to have experiences of risk. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, I agree. And we also need to be aware of our implicit biases that may cause us to use terms that denigrate other people when that's not really the best terminology to express what's in our hearts.
So I need more about that, Richard.
I guess cuteness is denigration.
Well, I agree with Jesse that any way that someone expresses their love for children, we need to encourage that and validate that and acknowledge that, right? And if it comes out as the word cute, that's fine. The world hasn't ended. But I think there are ways in which we need to be looking at our languaging, like the word cute, because it may inadvertently denigrate someone when we're so it's really, when I speak against the word cute, it's not about speaking against anyone who uses the word,
Yeah.
but it's an invitation to ask people who use the word to reflect on it and make sure that it's the most accurate word you want to use. For example, I've been meaning to tell you, Heather, you're so cute in the way
Thanks, man.
you do this show. You do this little show.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. I see this happen. I see what you're doing.
It's really cute.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I definitely have seen people like watch a child cry about something and talk about how cute it was, like a child in distress,
Yes.
and talk about it being cute.
Yes.
Or like the this is our get along shirt where two kids are shoved in one t-shirt, and we're posting it on social media to make fun of them for having human feelings and having conflict, and everyone is like, oh, it's such a cute idea, like that.
Well, but I think we get back to this.
But that's not where I think we're going here.
And I guess, but Richard, you're kind of bringing up this question that I sort of have with the DAP, and that, like, I don't think we say that we embrace or advocate every form that people show their love to children in, because there's a lot of not healthy ways that people show love for children. And I think it really is important to understand how people have been shown love as children and then show love as children and show love to children, because that impacts how children communicate with us. So I think understanding it in those terms is really important. I think what we're creating space for, or what we're advocating through how we treat other people, is kind of maybe sort of what I'm talking about. And so I think that in the work that we do, the people that are using the word cute are people that are like really devoted to understanding learning and environment. So they're not using it in a I
So
haven't
it's
seen it
like
used
there's a
in a sense that's
contextual
belittling. It's
element.
like, yeah, there's a contextual element, I think, sure. And I think there always is with language, right? Because language is so slippery, like words
Yeah.
like love, right? It's notoriously hard to pin down anything on anything, right? But I do think that I think understanding people's feelings and like showing them respect is really important, is an important part of the way we think about love.
Mhm.
And insofar as like people aren't, I don't know. I mean, I think there's this question of how we interpret harm, right? And harm that's caused. And particularly when I think about language. And again, this becomes a big question in like all sorts of packages that are sold to addressing how we talk and think and how we feel even about ourselves, right? Social emotional learning, those curricula, it's like a lot of that is exploring our own feelings and for good reason, right? Like our boundaries with children are really important. And so the people that are talking about cuteness are people with like very bounded ideas of love that
Mhm.
isn't about protect, like, so I don't know. I can see I understand where, and now again, that was my response initially to hearing it, right?
Yeah.
Was doesn't sound right to me, but then I thought about it. And
Well,
then
like
I've
Heather
and then in
said,
practice, I've just seen how I communicate with teachers and parents. And it's like a lot of times they're saying it and like they're great conversation partners about the abilities of their children,
Mhm.
particularly when I'm not trying to address or correct or have negative feelings about how they use language.
well, as Heather said, it's really context based. So in the context of Angie County, that word cute is used and is heard in one way. And in a vast number of American early childhood programs, perhaps that word cute is used in a way that objectifies the subject.
I would just say I've had a lot of conversations with a lot of early childhood experts where I've shown them pictures of my kids, they've shown them pictures of their students. We talked about it. Like it's a part of our discourse and our language. So I also don't want to be hypocritical here and say that it's like some standard where I don't say the word, right?
Well,
There are
and
words,
I
there
mean,
are
that's
words
kind of,
I don't use the word crazy. I don't use the word insane. I don't
yeah.
judge other people for using those words, but that's something I'm very intentional about. Cuteness is not one of those words for me.
Yeah.
It is
I
for
think, I mean, this could go another 45 minutes. And I definitely say things are cute, but I also
Honestly,
see,
worksheet is a worse word for me.
yeah, right. For me, it's more of just like and then I have to look at specifically how it's being used in front of me or how I'm reading it being used before I decide whether I feel like it's something I'm gonna get worked up about. And
Yep.
so yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of both what both of you have said here. But we have been going almost an hour. I don't want to make it seem like I got tired of the boys fighting, so I'm going to shut off the show.
But I mean, well,
No, you go ahead. Go ahead,
yeah,
Justin.
I mean, there's one other thing that I think about a lot, which is that part of the Anji play approach is, again, taking videos of children deeply engaged in play and then sharing those videos with other people, right? And part of that is about people having like positive emotional experiences in response to something the teachers created and provided. And so we can talk about, I mean, I would argue for that being like very strong evidence, but we can talk about like the way in which using emotion is important in making change. And it's not manipulative to like take positive emotional responses to things to
Right.
like bring people into the child's perspective or like a better understanding of who they are and what they need and what they can do.
Yeah. I don't think anyone here would
I worry about
argue
it,
with that. Yeah.
I worry about that. Right.
Sure.
That's why we all think Anji play is amazing.
I know.
Appreciate that.
The rest of the
Yeah,
world,
Yeah.
but you're preaching to the choir here.
Yeah.
No, I know.
Yeah, I'm getting ready to. I'm teaching the introduction to early childhood class this 8 weeks, and every week we do a different like theory or philosophy that we dive into. And Anji Play's coming up here in a couple of weeks. I'm very excited. I always have fun.
For us too.
And for one thing, it is like the shock factor of my students seeing love listed in that list of priorities.
Yes, I do the same thing, Heather, in my
Yeah.
intro class.
Yeah.
Anji plays a part of it.
Yeah.
I mean, I appreciate you all being so open to like this conversation, to sharing what because to me, it's like we're kind of out on a limb in certain ways. And in funny ways, it's like, it's so aligned with what so many amazing educators have been saying. That's why it's like, I'm sometimes like, oh my God, like, how come everybody's arguing this? Like other people have been saying we need to like do this kind of thing. So
yeah. Are you trying to get in with something here, Bethany?
No, I was just agreeing.
Just agreeing.
Yeah. I in the previous conversation we had, I stated that I don't know a whole lot about Anju play. But anytime that I read anything about it, I'm like, well, duh. Like,
I know. I've
of
been
course
begging
this is
Jesse for
how
a
we
book
should.
for 4 years now.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a long, complicated conversation.
Yeah. Yeah, we might have more than one of those kinds of stories on this screen right now.
I'm sure.
All right, well, I'm gonna wrap this up
Yeah.
because it's been a really great conversation, but we are getting close to an hour here. So thank you, all three of you, for coming to talk. And Jesse, thanks for suggesting that we do a follow-up after we did the other episode with this article called Stepping Back to Nature, to Nurture. Not to nature. That's a different one. And thanks everybody else for listening to another episode. We'll be back next week. Bye.
Bye.